Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am thrilled to introduce this virtual event with Clint Smith presenting his new book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, which debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And tonight he is in conversation with Min Jin Lee. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community. Every week, we host events here on our Zoom account. This month features events with Lin-Manuel Miranda, Stacey Abrams, and a conversation with Brandon Fleming and Nick Stone. Please check out the event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. This event will have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I will be posting a link to purchase copies of How the Word is Passed on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. We thank you all so much for showing up and tuning in, both in support of our authors and also of the truly incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. Of course, we hope that they don't, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. We thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Clint Smith is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of the poetry collection Counting Descent, which won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. His writing has been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Poetry Magazine, The Paris Review, and many other publications. Min Jin Lee's novel Pachinko was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction, a runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, winner of the Medici Book Club Prize, and a New York Times 10 Best Books of 2017. Lee's debut novel, Free Food for Millionaires, was a national bestseller and on top 10 Books of the Year lists for the Times of London, NPR's Fresh Air, and USA Today. They will be discussing Clint Smith's groundbreaking new book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. In the book, Dr. Smith recounts his visits to 9 sites that memorialize, distort, or evade their connections to chattel slavery. From the African Burial Ground National Monument in Lower Manhattan to a Confederate Memorial Chapel in Petersburg, Virginia, to a Juneteenth celebration in Galveston, Texas, How the Word is Passed explores the ways in which America commemorates itself with thorough research and bell-like clarity. The New York Times praises Smith's unapologetically subjective map of American memory is an extraordinary contribution to the way we understand ourselves. I am honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Clint and Min.
Hi, how are you, Clint?
I'm so good. I'm so glad to be here. I can't think of any way to celebrate what's happened the last 24 hours better than being in conversation with one of my favorite writers.
Well, folks, Clint is #1 at the New York Times bestseller list. It's pretty incredible and cool. And you know what? That's going to be when we build your monument, we're going to put that on the bottom. How's that, UDC? UDC.
Oh man. Confederates.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I'm so happy this is happening because I think this book is just amazing. You guys, like this book is really, really amazing. And it's also so moving to read. It's beautifully written. It's an incredibly important primary document as well as a secondary source because you are writing about your experiences of what it's like to understand the way slavery is understood today in 2021. How long did it take for you to write this book?
4 years. So the book
4 years.
started in May 2017, or began to be conceptualized in May 2017, watching the Confederate statues come down in New Orleans. So, I was watching the statues of Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis come down in my hometown in New Orleans, and just thinking about, well, what did it mean that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And just started thinking about how the city reckoned with or failed to reckon with its own relationship to the history of slavery, a history that is ingrained and embedded in the physical infrastructure of that city in a profound way. And then kind of opened it up and started thinking about other places across the country and across the ocean, and how they were telling that story. And so much of this, so I've been writing it for 4 years, but so much of this is animated by trying to write into the gaps and to fill the gaps that I felt like I had experienced and that I was carrying from a young age, and trying to answer a lot of questions and fill a lot of voids in my own education that I hadn't had the answers to. And the book was almost a process of attempting to fill those gaps.
Well, actually, I memorized your book, Clint. So I was wondering if you could read this one paragraph on page 171 when you talk specifically about what you just said. And the reason why I want you to read it is because I want those who are here today to see how beautifully he renders the emotion and the memory and the inspiration of this book. So it starts with "I was born" on page 171, just that paragraph.
I was born and raised in a city filled with statues of Confederate soldiers, white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where Black people played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In my hometown of New Orleans, there are at least 100 streets, statues, parks, and schools named after Confederate figures, slave owners, and defenders of slavery. For decades, Black children have walked into buildings named after people who thought of them as property. My own middle school, Lusher, is named after Robert Mills Lusher, a Confederate and former Louisiana superintendent of education who fought against desegregation and believed in, quote, the supremacy of the Caucasian race. Every time I returned home, I would drive on streets named for those who thought of me as chattel.
See, I read that paragraph and it just, right here, because I think what really kills me is this idea that all these little children have no idea. Because I'm positive that your teachers aren't talking about it. I'm positive that the principal isn't saying, oh, isn't it wonderful? But every day you're thinking, oh, I have to go to Lusher, or I have to do this at the school, or passing by certain streets. And without knowing or without being taught that history, because that history is either considered either shameful or we revise it to think of it as something just as part of the lore. But the reality of the true history, which is not even can even be disputed, is really painful, because at the center of it, it means that a certain body is property, right? So how did it, like, at what point did you make that connection between Lusher and who Lusher is and how you feel about it?
For so many of these statues and so many of the buildings, so many of the memorials, so much of the iconography around New Orleans, I had no idea growing up. I mean, I used to feed the ducks in City Park under the literal statue of P.G.T. Beauregard, right? A man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. On the way to school every day, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard. To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway. Again, the street my parents live on today is named after somebody who enslaved over 150 enslaved people. And so I didn't know those things at all really growing up. I had no real conception of who these folks were. And to the extent that I did, I was just told that they were important men in Louisiana history. Um, and what's interesting is that like Robert E. Lee isn't even an important man in Louisiana history. He's from Virginia, right? Like so I mean there are multiple levels to the sort of absurdity.
So why are we told these things? Why are little children told these men are important to us? And why should we revere these monuments? Why are they there? Why do you, I mean, what do you say to your kids about this?
So, I mean, the reason that they were so many of these Confederate statues and slaveholding and statues to slaveholders were erected was with the specific intention of distorting their legacy and to sort of mold their legacy in a way that was much more favorable than the reality of the project that they were tied to, right? So the Confederacy is by like historical fact and grounded in primary source documents, a territory that seceded, treasonous territory that seceded from the United States and raised an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. And the insidiousness of white supremacy is that it turns that statement from an empirical one into an ideological one.
Yes.
Right. And it attempts to say that me saying that is reflective of my political sensibilities instead of being something that's grounded in primary source documents like the Declarations of Confederate Secession, where in 1861, a state like Mississippi says verbatim, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Right. So they weren't vague about why they were seceding from the Union. They were quite clear about it. They were quite clear about why the Civil War was about to begin. And so the idea that we would have statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and P.G.T. Beauregard and schools named after Lusher represents a late 19th century, early 20th century attempt to essentially gaslight this country into thinking that who these men were is not who they actually were. And we see that in somebody like Alexander Stephens, who in 1861 writes the famous Cornerstone speech, or the infamous Cornerstone speech, where he says that the Confederacy is founded on the principle of African inferiority and the attempt to engage in chattel slavery in perpetuity. And then in 1865 comes back and people are like, well, what do you have to say for yourself? You just like, you lost the war, you were the vice president of this country that attempted to secede from the Union. And you said all these horrific things about slavery. And he was like, I never said that. And they were like, what are you talking about? We were there. We saw you. It was in the paper. And he was like, no, you must be mistaken. I never said anything like that. And it's eerily parallel to some of the things that we see now, where people attempt to try to tell us that we're not seeing things that we just saw, and attempt to tell us that things are not about what the people who have engaged in that behavior say that they're about. And so I learned about these things, many of this stuff I learned, in the process of writing the book. I don't think I knew that Lusher was named after a Confederate leader until maybe 2 years ago. And this was my middle school. But I think part of what happens when you learn this history is that it provides a sort of clarity about why our society collectively looks the way that it does today. And I think why the reason that one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because simply of the people in those communities, but often is because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. Because symbols, they're not just symbols, they're reflective of the stories that we tell. And these stories embed themselves into narratives that communities carry, and narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And so that's not to say taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee is going to reduce the racial wealth gap, but it is to say that that is part of a much larger ecosystem of factors and ideas and stories that shape how we think about what communities deserve or don't deserve.
Well, yes. Well, quickly, when you talk about the empirical turning into ideological, it is such a powerful idea when we take real facts and make them into opinion, mm-hmm. right? Or theory, which are very, very different things. But what I was just curious about is, what really upsets me, about your book and about what's going on, not just in America, but around the world, is this profound resistance to the reckoning, the profound resistance to the empirical. And when I see that fighting to hold on to something, and when I was reading your book, I kept on focusing on, should I focus on the individuals who don't want the history taught, which is literally what's happening in certain legislatures in America right now? Or should I focus on the fact that we have these public historians, these well-intentioned guides who are willing to tell the truth about their community and their ancestors? So I was really moved by the guide and Monticello, right? And what he's trying to do, or what Damaris is trying to do in New York. So these are individuals. So the way the book is structured is Clint goes to all these different places, and very often there's an individual who will be a kind of a guide, literally a guide, or a docent who will kind of walk with Clint, and then we become both the guide as well as Clint. I mean, there's a real fictional dramatic aspect to the way this book is structured, which I found really appealing and really inclusive of our experience and our emotional tenor for how to feel about history, which I really admired. So what I wanted to ask you is, who do you focus on? Do you focus on the individuals who are willing to confront the truth, or do you dwell on the fact that there's humongous pockets of people who are saying, no, 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 that's part of my history, and too bad for you. Too bad that you're a little boy and you go to a school named Lusher. Like, that's just too bad.
I think I'm fascinated by, and part of the reason that I go to a place like Blandford is because Blandford being one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, it's a place where in Petersburg, Virginia, the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And in the book, I go there for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. And I don't go to a place like that because I have any hopes of convincing those people to believe what is true. I go there because I think as a researcher, as a reporter, as a journalist, as a curious person, I'm genuinely trying to understand how they come to believe what they believe.
Right.
And so it was important for me to go to that place in not in an antagonistic stance, or not in a way that it was attempting to like prove them wrong, or suggest that what they there's like an update happening on my computer right now. It's a virtual world. It is not an attempt to convince them of something that they don't want to believe. It is an attempt to gain clarity. And I think I do gain clarity. I got clarity that for so many people, history is not about empirical evidence or primary source documents. It's a story they have been told, and it's a story that they tell. It is an heirloom that is passed down across generations. It is something that is deeply entangled in their emotional sense of who they are in the world and who their family is in the world. And so providing them, showing them, the declarations of Confederate secession isn't necessarily going to move or shift how they think, because it's not about evidence or things that they know or don't know. It's about their relationship to the people who have told them certain stories. And then, but to your point, for me, I do think that part of what's evident in the book is that there are a lot of people who are not antagonistic to new information or antagonistic necessarily to the truth, but who literally just don't know. I think about the Donna and Grace who I met at Monticello,
Right.
Who are two women who were on the tour given by David Thorson, the tour guide at Monticello, who had given this hour-long tour that was really quite direct about Jefferson's moral inconsistency, about Jefferson's relationship to slavery, and the fact that he enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. And these women were so clearly unsettled by what they were hearing. And I went up to them after, and they were like, I had no idea that Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea that Monticello was a plantation. And these are folks who bought plane tickets, who rented a car, who got a hotel room, who came to Monticello almost as a sort of pilgrimage, and had no conception of the idea that this place was a plantation, and that the person who lived there enslaved hundreds of human beings. And I think that's a microcosm for how so many people in this country have such little understanding of what slavery was, how it shaped the founding of this country, and subsequently how it continues to shape every part of our social, political, and economic infrastructure.
Well, it's funny that you say that because I was thinking about them a lot. I was actually really thinking very hard about those two women in Monticello since I've been reading the book. And their kind of innocent shock this about what's going on. And I did feel some compassion for them, but it almost seemed to be it's hard to believe. It's actually
Mm,
hard to believe in the privilege of saying, I will not see that part about that world, and I
mm,
can continue to do so. And why are you telling me? And then I thought, okay, let's just assume that these are innocent people who just didn't know
mm,
because schools didn't teach it to them. And it was kind of shocking to me because when I was 16 years old, part of my history class at the Bronx High School of Science was to read Kenneth Stamp's Peculiar Institution. So I
wow.
read the entire book
Oh
when I
man.
was 16, and I was a
Sure.
new American. I came to America when I was 7. So after 9 years of speaking English, I read that entire book, and it changed the way I think about slavery, right?
Yeah.
And when I became a history major in college, it was a very easy thing for me to understand because, and Kenneth Stamp's book, which you quote quite a bit in your book, he was somebody that Dr. King quoted
Mhm.
in terms of understanding that slavery was not an institution in which people who were the enslaved people were not happy about it. They were not treated well. And have you seen Netflix's recent show, High on the Hog?
No, but people keep tagging
Oh,
me and talking about it, and they're like, they're saying that they like read the book and are watching the show but they're
right.
in conversation with one another. So I haven't, but I definitely need to.
Oh, but there's one episode about Jefferson in particular, and about how he gave very meager rations
Mhm.
to the enslaved people that he had. And so they had to grow gardens in order to have sufficient calories to do the heavy work of outdoor labor. And when you think about a rich man like that, who was able, and you say this very clearly in your book, he was able to read, write, and think about democracy because enslaved people were doing free labor for him, and he didn't even feed them properly.
Yeah.
So when you think about it that way, like, how can we think about the ideals of democracy at the personal hypocrisy of the architect of democracy, right? I mean, it was so disturbing to me, but I was wondering about, in terms of resistance, the emotional resistance that people have to not being converted. And there's a beautiful passage that you wrote on page 172. It is one paragraph, and I was wondering if you could read it for us because you got everything in this one paragraph. And I told you I memorized your book. Yeah.
I mean, I can tell. I'm honored. 172. This is also a format that I've not really done before, sort of
Oh,
periodic
yeah.
reading.
I'm just trying to keep you on your toes.
Here you
So
go.
it begins with "for many of the people" and just that one paragraph.
Okay. For many of the people I met at Blandford, the story of the Confederacy is the story of their home, of their family. And the story of their family is the story of them. So when they are asked to reckon with the fact that their ancestors fought a war to keep my ancestors enslaved, there is a resistance to facts that have been documented by primary sources and contemporaneous evidence. They are forced to confront the lies they have upheld. They are forced to confront the flaws of their ancestors. As Greg Stewart, a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, told the New York Times in the aftermath of the 2015 Charleston massacre, quote, "You're asking me to agree that my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were monsters. Accepting such a reality would for them mean the deterioration of a narrative that has long been part of their lineage and the disintegration of so much of who they believe themselves to be in the world."
Yeah. So is it possible for us to believe that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson were monsters? Right? Is that hard for us to say? And also, is it possible that you could be a beautiful thinker and have amazing architectural taste and be a gourmand and be a monster?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Even that sort of formulation is fascinating because I'm almost less interested in, for Greg saying you're asking me to accept my great great grandfather was a monster. And I'm like, I'm not really interested in the interiority of your grandfather's spirit, or like what's in his heart, you know? Like, it's much less interesting or relevant to me if you think or don't think your great grandfather was a monster. What's more important to me is that you accept that your grandfather fought to preserve a monstrous cause. Um, and that it's almost kind of like how we think about like people who are like, there's not a racist bone in my body, or like there's, you know, no racist blood in my heart, or whatever formulations people use. And it's like, I'm not interested in the sort of the spiritual or physiological notions of racism in relation to your body. I think it's more important to think about, and we're having a much more robust conversation about this in our national discourse now, relative to what we had before, thinking about history, thinking about systems, thinking about structures. Um, you know, I think all the time about this James Baldwin essay, A Talk to Teachers, that he wrote in 1963, or a speech he delivered in 1963 to a group of New York City educators. I think it was published in 1964. And he says a lot of amazing things in it, and touches on slavery a lot. But one of the things that he says is that Black children are told over and over and over again that they are criminal. And the role of the teacher, and he's using teacher here literally, but also as a sort of metonym for a larger society, it's like the role of the teacher is to help that child understand that although the world tells them over and over again that they are criminal, that it is in fact the society and the history that created the conditions that that Black child is growing up in that is the criminal. And it's like, it's an intuitive thing for many of us, and it's very clear for many of us, but I think we can, I know this from having been a high school English teacher, I know this from having been a Black child growing up in New Orleans, that there a lot of folks internalize the falsehoods and the pathology that we're inundated with. You know, in my case, I was inundated with growing up in New Orleans. And sometimes when you don't have the language or the toolkit or the framework with which to push back against it, there can be a sort of psychological and emotional paralysis where you know what you're hearing is wrong, but you don't necessarily know how to say it, or how to say why it's wrong, and explain it. And so when people are telling you these sorts of things, the sorts of things that the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy literally created after the Civil War in the late 19th century, in order to distort and confuse an entire society so that we don't really know what to believe. And because the goal of the Lost Cause is not to make everybody a white supremacist. It's a sort of Orwellian project that is meant to make everything so cloudy and foggy that you're like, well, maybe the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, or like maybe, you know, and so it just makes things so murky that it's difficult for us to have like an epistemological consensus and to be operating from the same foundations of knowledge and truth. And so then you have people like the Sons of Confederate Veterans who genuinely believe what they believe, because again, it's like entangled in this more this like deep sense of self, this psychological and emotional project that is kind of like, that could care less about, you know, what the primary source documents or historical facts have to say.
Can you talk about the lost cause? Because I think that that is one of the most important things that it's not taught actually in history. I mean, you and I understand what it is, but I think the average person doesn't know what the lost cause is. And could you just sort of define it for us?
Yeah, so the Lost Cause is a sort of multi-pronged effort that was primarily engaged by through the United Daughters of the Confederacy after the end of the Civil War. And essentially it's saying that slavery wasn't that bad. Mm-hmm. And slavery was a civilizing institution that was, as John Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina, and at one point our vice president, said, it is a positive good for both Black and white people alike. And that Black people were much better off here enslaved than they were in Africa. The other part of it is saying, well, slavery wasn't that bad. Also, the Civil War wasn't even about slavery, so it doesn't really matter. And then it's also saying that the people who were fighting for the Confederacy were people who were simply fighting to defend their families and their states, and they were fighting to defend themselves from Northern aggression. They literally call it the War of Northern Aggression. And as one of the people that I met at Blandford said, a guy named Jeff, he was like, if they had just stayed up north, everything would have been fine. And in my mind, I'm like, well, fine for who? Right? Clearly not fine for the 4 million enslaved Black people at that time. And so again, it represents, it is centering a group of people who are in fact the perpetrators of a crime. And so essentially it is attempting to distort and misrepresent the nature of what the Civil War and slavery, the nature of what the Civil War was fought over, and what slavery as an institution was. And Kenneth Stamp, who you brought up before, I think people take for granted or don't even know that until the Civil Rights Movement, and writers like and historians like Kenneth Stamp with his book, and particularly Kenneth Stamp, the predominant view in the early 20th century of slavery was the one propagated by historians like Ulrich B. Phillips, who were like, slavery was a civilizing institution. The plantation was a great place for enslaved folk to be. There were plenty of benevolent slave owners. And that is how most Americans through the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s thought of slavery, until you had historians like Kenneth Stamp come and make clear that the reason the disparities between Black and white communities existed in the mid 20th century in the way that they did was intimately tied to an institution that had ended less than 100 years ago. And so really grounding the sort of origin point of Black-white inequality in chattel slavery, which seems so self-evident and obvious, but really wasn't part of the sort of national and public discourse of how we understood what inequality was at that time in this country.
Well, I think that this is so important because when I was researching, when I researched my fiction, and I was really looking into colonialism and imperialism, so often the Christianizing force, the taking of the savages and making them into noble, that is a very common ideology that's found throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries as to justify their systematic campaign of stealing. Stealing and murder. And rather than looking at the nations that are the criminals, they actually make the objects of their criminality into the criminals themselves. Like that's the ultimate gaslighting that we're speaking about. Right. What I think is hard about what we just said and what we're agreeing upon, and it's documented in your book, is that those who are hearing it are saying, oh, well, if you're white, you feel bad listening to this. You feel bad reading this. I don't want to deal with it. And then I've also heard people of color and BIPOC community members saying things like, like that was a long time ago. And then I've also seen within the African-American community where you have immigrants saying about American descendants of slaves, oh, well, I don't know, like what your problem is. And rather than looking at the systematic roots as to why, if you have less capital to start out with, how could you possibly get somewhere? And I was just curious, like, how do you reconcile with all the different voices within our own? I mean, for me, like, I'm thinking, maybe I can't reach certain groups. Okay, I'll try. I'll really try. But if I can't, how do I even reach members of my own community who reject and support the majority's point of view?
It's a great question. So I would say that I am sympathetic to those who say that, like, all, we cannot only consume Black media or Black literature or Black history that is grounded in our trauma or grounded in our oppression or grounded in slavery or Jim Crow. I absolutely believe that Blackness in this country is a beautiful, remarkable, heterogeneous, pluralistic, centuries-long project that deserves to have all sorts of media and books and literature and art created that reflects the heterogeneity of that experience, and as
well as the joy, right?
Yeah,
the joy and the humor
of that experience. Absolutely.
Right.
So I would never, I very much agree with that. And I think that there are some people, and part of what you're alluding to is there's this idea, I think, from some folks, even in my own community, who are like, oh, another, like, more slave Underground Railroad, or like another slavery book, or like, and I get the impulse, But I think, again, part of the insidiousness of white supremacy is that it makes us feel like we talk about slavery all the time when we actually don't talk about it in any way that is commensurate with the impact that it had on this country, right? Like, part of what I want this book to make clear is our both temporal and physical proximity to this period of time. So slavery existed, if we're thinking about 1619 as being a sort of symbolic marker of the beginning of slavery in the British American colonies, to 1865, existed for 250 years and has only not existed for 150, right? So we had this institution that existed before the country was even a country and has existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter. She was the daughter in 2016 of someone born into intergenerational chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved, right? So when my 4-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap, and I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was so long ago, in the scope of human history, wasn't that long ago at all. And so the idea that that would have no impact on what our contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is both morally and intellectually disingenuous. And so part of what I want readers to understand and feel is that, you know, we're made to feel like slavery was this thing that happened in the Jurassic period. It's like dinosaurs and Flintstones and slavery. But again, like, it wasn't. And I think I experienced a sort of transformational understanding of my proximity to this period of time in the process of writing this book, in part because I was physically standing on the land where so much of this happened, and like physically standing inside of slave cabins where enslaved people themselves lived, walking across land that enslaved people had cultivated, standing inside of buildings where enslaved people were told they were free. I had a different sense of intimacy, and the sort of sensory experience of it all made me feel much closer to it. But also the sort of temporal aspect made me feel much closer to it. And so I say all that to say, this slavery is something that has just profoundly shaped our country in ways that I think before writing this book, I understood in an abstract way. I was like, slavery shaped America and the slaves built White House. And, you know, like I understood it, but like, I didn't get it. But I think it is important for us to not run from a history that is painful, because we are made to feel as if that is the only type of way we should consume our history. What we should consume this history, and part of what I try to capture in the book, is what's remarkable is all that has been accomplished in spite of that history, or was born out of that history. And I think that you can see examples of that, you know, in the United States and in colonized groups of people across the world. It's these remarkable stories of art and literature and culture that are born out of these unimaginable, unfathomable circumstances. So I think it's a both and, right? We need TV and movies and books that reflect the wide range of the Black experience, the painful aspects and the joyful aspects. But we also shouldn't allow ourselves to be convinced that we talk about this too much, because, you know, something I tell people is nobody would ever say, sometimes people would be like, oh, there's so many movies about slavery, and there's not actually one. Like, actually there are not that many films or television series about slavery relative to the like period of time that it existed in this country. And two, nobody would ever say that about a World War II movie. There's a World War II movie nominated for an Academy Award every year.
Right.
You know, nobody would seem absurd. There'd be like too many World War II movies. It would seem absurd, and also like kind of like adjacent to insensitive or offensive. But that we are made to feel, again, all the time, like, oh, it's like 12 years slave, and now we got Underground Railroad. And there's, you know, there's good art and bad art, and good history and bad history, and good literature and bad literature. But I don't think that we should decide not to pretend as if the sort of oppressive aspects of our history did not exist, and simply lift up more joyous aspects, without understanding the way that so much of that joy emerged from so much intergenerational pain. And I think that these things can be framed in ways that are nuanced and thoughtful, and not like inundating people with a sort of trauma porn, but like laying out the reality of what happened, and simply being honest about it and making people confront it and see it on its most human terms.
I also think that to not have this history, even though it can be painful, is to lose your superpowers. Because I think the history of resistance and survival and workarounds and of the revolution that must have existed in your heart to somehow every single day insist on dignity, integrity. Like, how did you not murder your enslavers? Like, that's incredible. Like, you have to just wonder, like, are enslaved people the kindest people in the world? Right?
And I think it's so important to make sure that we are not, to your point, like not thinking about resistance singularly and so its most massive and in some ways sort of like gendered terms, right? Where like the big slave rebellion or like they killed the master. But like resistance, to your point, was there are millions of enslaved people who resisted slavery in millions of different ways every single day, right? To build a family, to love your children, to protect your children, to build community, to find love, to find moments of respite. All of those things are forms of resistance in the face of a set of circumstances that are just, for so many of us, are just unfathomable. And I think it's really important that we have a holistic view of what resistance looked like, that isn't limited to, you know, as impressive as they are, like a Harriet Tubman, a Frederick Douglass, or a Nat Turner, or any of these important historical figures, but that resistance was far more, sometimes far more subtle, but no less important.
Well, as a matter of fact, the resistance that I was thinking about in particular, I'm going backwards in the book now, is poetry, right? That we were able to connect with our feelings and then to write our responses to oppression, to hatred, and that we were insisting and resisting with our humanity, with our artistic ability to make something beautiful out of trauma. And I was wondering if you could read, because you are a poet, what your thoughts about Phillis Wheatley. I was wondering if you could share with us your incredible section on page 28. At the time I encountered the passage, just that paragraph, and then we ended, we live in.
At the time I encountered this passage, I was finishing what would be my first collection of poetry. I was writing in the aftermath of the Ferguson uprising, using poetry to process the incessant state-sanctioned violence happening to Black people all around me, attempting to put my life in conversation with this political moment and the history that birthed it. I spent hours poring over both the voice and the form of my poems, revising, rearranging, adding, and deleting until there were dozens of iterations of each stanza, every line. I thought of how seriously I took the craft. I thought of how all of my work, even in response to violence, stemmed from a place of love, a love of my community, a love of my family, a love of my partner, a love of those hoping to build a better world than the one we live in.
How about that for the most evolved sense of resistance? So yes, I want Nat Turner. Yes, I want Harriet Tubman, but yes, I also want Phillis Wheatley. And the idea that Thomas Jefferson can actually say that poetry that is beneath it, I mean, what is it? It's beneath the dignity of responding to it critically. Like the fact that he could dismiss the art and yet he can have children who are Black. Like, I mean, to me, I will never, ever, ever consider Thomas Jefferson in the same way. Like I can say, you know what, you had some very cool ideas that you took from, let's say, Rousseau and Locke. You spun it, took ownership of it. But I'm not going to forget that you took some ideas from some white guys in Europe as well. And you're able to justify your bad behavior. And somehow white Americans today are thinking that he's a good guy. And I want to know like how far you can go back, but this is really important to me because I wanted to talk about you being an artist. And there's a wonderful paragraph here on page 26. So see, I am going backwards. Just when you start with Donna and Donna and Grace are the two women that Clint meets when he goes to Monticello. And that paragraph, that first paragraph, if you could read that for us on page 26.
Donna and Grace, and so many people, specifically white people, have often understood slavery and those held in its grip only in abstract terms. They do not see the faces. They cannot picture the hands. They do not hear the fear or the laughter. They do not consider that these were children like their own, or that these were people who had birthdays and weddings and funerals, who loved and celebrated one another just as they loved and celebrated their loved ones.
See, for me, that is the whole point of writing at all, because we have to be specific. We have to be particular. And the only way we can ever have the accretion of qualities of human beings and then to have the drama of their lives is when we can actually see that how can I possibly hurt another person, because the other person is a person. And I think in this work, I was so moved by it. Nell is going to come back because there are folks who have been patiently waiting to ask you questions. Nell, where are you?
All right, let me unmute myself. Okay, thank you. Oh my gosh, this is just, my head is exploding. This is incredible conversation. This is beautiful. But yes, we do have some questions. Ashley Ford is
Ashley Ford
here. Yeah. So and she
New York
asked,
Times bestseller Ashley Ford.
Yes, right. Yes, exactly.
Every time I see me and Ashley post together on Instagram or on Twitter, anywhere, my heart just flutters. Man, Ashley, who talked to Oprah yesterday, real MVP, one of my dear friends. Wow. Thank you for watching.
What a beautiful memoir. Hi, Ashley. We love you.
Hi, Ashley. And Ashley asks, which, if any, of the places you visited during your research would you want to return to?
Good question.
Probably the Whitney Plantation. And I did return to it. So I actually did my reporting at the place, maybe I guess I think I went there in February 2019. And then I went back for Thanksgiving of 2019 because my family was all in New Orleans for my grandmother's 80th birthday. And so part of what we did was we all went to the Whitney Plantation together as a family. And I write about my grandparents at the end of the book in the epilogue. And I was there with my grandmother, who, if you read the book, part of what I talked to her about is the way that she learned about slavery. And she was carrying a lot of shame because she had been taught that they had been taught so many of the lessons that everyone was taught in the early 20th century when they were learning about slavery, which is slavery was a civilizing institution. There were benevolent slave owners. They were saved from the savagery of Africa. And she was on her own journey at 80 years old of sort of unlearning so much of what she had been taught her entire life. When we were at the Whitney, this place in Louisiana that centers the lives of enslaved people and is surrounded by a constellation of plantations where people continue to hold weddings and take pictures in front of the homes of enslavers, have bridal suites in former slave cabins. The Whitney fundamentally rejects the idea we can understand a plantation as anything other than a torture site. But at the same time, that we should understand the people who were held at that torture site as fully human individuals. And so when I went with my grandparents and the rest of my wife, my kids, my parents, it was so powerful to see the impact that like a 60-minute tour could have on people. And I was almost like watching them during the tour. And I thought about writing about it, but I almost wanted to preserve the sort of intimacy of that moment. It was just so powerful because what the Whitney does is so exceptional, but it shouldn't be. Like this is how the story of slavery should be told at every plantation across the country. So I would go there. I think it is an example of a place that is working really hard to do to tell the story of a plantation in the way that it should be told. And I think it is a powerful place that is can be a catalyst for all sorts of learning and unlearning and recalibration of how we understand what slavery was. So actually, when you come visit me in New Orleans, we'll go to the Whitney.
Mm.
Yeah, and then we'll eat cupcakes.
And we have an anonymous attendee question who writes, was there anything you came across in your research that surprised you?
Yes. I've gotten this question a couple times over the past 2 weeks of media stuff. And I know we're running close on time, so I'm going to give rapid fire answers. Is Angola prison. So I've been teaching at prisons for the last 7 years in Massachusetts and in DC. But I was not prepared for what I saw when I was at Angola. And specifically, I mean, there's a whole lot to say about Angola, which is a prison built on top of a former plantation, which disproportionately incarcerates Black men, in which they go out into fields and work for virtually no pay while somebody watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. But that place had a gift shop, and it had shot glasses and coffee mugs and baseball caps and sweatshirts. And then on one of the coffee mugs, it said, it had the silhouette of a watchtower and said Angola, a gated community, as if to sort of belittle or make a mockery of the thousands of people who were being held and continue to be held in that prison. So
oh my God.
I have a lot to say about Angola. I could have written an entire book just about that experience, but I was surprised. I was deeply surprised, unsettled, and haunted by the profound lack, the cravenness of a place like that. It just felt so wrong on so many levels.
Whew. I just need a minute with that. Okay. Let's see here. So I can read words again. Oh, here we go. From Dawn Dorland, who writes, could you speak about the creative process that led you to consider these histories in reported prose instead of poetry?
Yeah, so when I originally conceived of the project, I actually thought it would be a collection of poems. I thought that I would write a poetry collection in which the conceit was that each poem would be about a different monument in New Orleans. And I would sort of create, my first book was a collection of poetry. And I thought that I was like, okay, well, poetry is my primary form of sorts, or at least was for a long time. And then I realized that, one, I think I wanted to go to places outside of New Orleans, so that was part of it. Two, I realized that it needed more room to breathe than a poem would allow for. And then three, I also realized that it couldn't be only my own sort of extended meditations on my experiences at these places. It had to be in conversation with the experience of other people there. Like, it had to have the voices of the guides. It had to have the voices of the public historians. It had to have the voices of the other people I was encountering on these journeys. I mean, like the chapter I write about Angola is largely shaped around a guy named Norris Henderson, who was incarcerated at Angola for almost 30 years and who's on this tour with me.
Oh my God.
And I think that I could have tried to write that chapter without speaking to Norris or being there alongside Norris. But like, when, he and I are on this bus that's moving through fields where people he was once incarcerated with are literally picking crops, and he's looking down at his hands and you see the calluses in his hands, and he's talking about how he used to work for 7 cents an hour in fields that he said himself, like, my ancestors might have been enslaved on this same land. It creates an entirely different sort of literary and sensory dynamic. And so part of what I wanted this book to do is bring the best of history, the best of journalism, the best of poetry, the best of literary nonfiction that I read. By the way, if you don't already know, I am the president of the Pachinko fan club. And, here we are. It's amazing that we've gone this long without me just turning this on its head and being like, so let's talk about it.
Turn to page 165.
Right, truly. And our next Harvard Bookstore event. I wanted to do the best to make it, to bring all of that together, to try to create something that almost wasn't defined by genre or confined by genre, and that attempted to sort of break it apart, and then break the pieces of each genre that I love and then put it together to create this different sort of literary and historical collage, and make it feel like the reader was on this journey with me, and that they weren't being talked at or preached to, or that this wasn't a didactic or jargony historical text, but I wanted it to be a history book that read like a novel, and that's what I tried to do.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind reading us this one last paragraph to close us out, because one of the pieces that we haven't discussed is your focus on education. You started out this project because you were a teacher, you were concerned about your students, but also you are a student. And I think that you are clearly a lifelong learner as well as an artist. And this one paragraph on page 293, the last paragraph, was so beautiful. And I wanted to share it because I think there are educators in this audience right now. And I think that they should know why you wrote this book.
This is about this is in the About This Project section. This is the last paragraph. Much of what shaped my desire to write this book was my experience as a high school teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. Though I was an English teacher, history informed both the way I approached the text that we read and how I made sense of the social realities of my students' lives. It was as a teacher that I first began to fully account for the way the history of this country shaped the landscape of my students' communities, from slavery to Jim Crow apartheid to mass criminalization and beyond. I've come to realize that those conversations with my students, now a decade ago, about how we might begin to understand our lives in relation to the world around us, were some of the earliest sparks of this book. I tried to write the sort of book I would have wanted to teach them. I hope I made them proud.
Well, we're so proud of you, Clint. And everybody go out and get this book. I believe every American should have this book. It is so beautiful. And you do us proud, Clint. Thank you so much, Harvard Bookstore. Everybody, please support your independent bookstores. They are our lifeblood. They make our neighborhoods, and they are good neighbors. They are our teachers. They are our friends. Thank you, Clint.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Keep reading. Stay safe, everyone. Have a good night. God, this was just an incredible conversation. Thanks to both of you. And yes, buy the book. I reposted the link.
Buy Pachinko from Harvard Bookstore.
And buy Pachinko from Harvard Bookstore too. Yeah.
And you're going to need your Post-it. So.
I love it.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Gosh,
Bye.
thank you. Have a good night.